before we pick up with Dr. Zelli, I believe we're on record, are we not, Madam Clerk? Okay. We are back and ready. Was there an issue we needed to take up? Just as we closed, Mr. Moore, you wanted to address me. Was there something we needed to take up before we began this afternoon? Yes. Okay, come forward.
Thank you, Your Honor. We contacted Judge Morris's office, and they deferred to you on the media pass for the professional court reporter, that we'd like to make a copy, a video copy, so that Bree's friends who are not in attendance could be able to watch that when they came home from college. And their office deferred to you. He said it was your presiding in your courtroom, and he was going to defer to you. So if you would permit that, we would retrieve our recorder and have it recorded. If not, then I respect your decision.
Okay. I had thought that might be the issue. I had sort of heard that from Madam Clerk when you were had said you wanted to address me. So during the lunch hour, I checked with Judge Morse and talked to him about the issue, and this is my decision. I will say it's with his concurrence, because the rule does say that videotaping of a proceeding other than by the news media has to be approved by the presiding judge of the judicial district. And that's why I deferred the request to him, because on its face it was from a court reporting outfit. It certainly was a unique request. Didn't happen in my tenure ever as a judge. And certainly anybody who knew me over the time that I was an active judge knew that I had a lot of high-profile cases, had the media in my courtroom on countless occasions, was always very liberal with requests to have cameras in my courtroom, was never bothered by their presence, really, like some judges were. In fact, was an advocate of the creation of this courtroom so that there was a place big enough to accommodate more than the two-camera rule that Administrative Rule 45 imposes on trial judges, and a place that could accommodate a large number of people. And I know times are evolving, and we're in an electronic age where recording proceedings is a lot easier than it used to be, but the Alaska courts are still more liberal than many states in allowing recordings and camera equipment in courtrooms, and there's a reason for it, and part of that reason is to preserve a certain dignity in the courtroom, and also because there's a difference between the right of the press to be here and the right of the people to be here to bear witness to what I'm doing, as opposed to just filming. I thought about the issue, and I thought, well, if Mr. Myovis wanted to hire a videographer to be here to just film the proceeding for 2 days, I would say no without thinking about it. I would just say, no, you gotta go get a recording. I'm not gonna have an extra camera in the courtroom. And I also don't know where I draw the line between allowing you, Mr. Moore, for maybe a valid reason, and having a recording to share with your daughter's friends about this proceeding, and having just some stranger in here wanting to have a recording of the next criminal trial that's held. And the presiding judge shared the judgment that once we sort of open the door to having other than credentialed news media set up cameras in the courtroom, it's kind of a floodgate that we don't know where to draw the line. And I share that view, despite my advocacy for allowing the news media to be here. It's just not the same for me to say that that's having additional cameras here just for private party use. That's acknowledging my respect for why you might want to have somebody here, but I'm still saying no. Part of that's because for me this is a very deliberative proceeding. I need time to think, I need space to think. I don't want to be distracted by additional things that I'm not used to. And so let's proceed in the normal course of events without additional cameras.
Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate your extended consideration, and I respect your decision. Thank you.
Mr. Lambert, please continue. Doctor, you're still under oath, of course.
Yes.
Just a second, Judge, I'm just looking at some notes here. Hey, Dr. Zaley, it's my understanding that you did a risk assessment of Mr. ALMEDA that also covered the area of his prospects for rehabilitation, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And one of the things that you used was the psychopathy checklist revised second edition?
Yes, the psychopathy checklist.
I'm sorry, psychopathy.
And I'm, of course, happy to answer any questions you have about that, but there were risk assessment components tapped in the personality assessment inventory also that we haven't discussed yet. Your call, of course,
Okay.
where you want to do it.
Well, I want to talk about the risk assessments, the measures that you took. So why don't you tell us all the things you used? I'm assuming you used the background information,
Yes,
all the clinical interview,
yes,
as well as the testing that you did for determining he had a borderline personality disorder, coupled with additional testing that you do for risk assessment. All of those things were considered?
well, yes, the testing informed the risk assessment and also informed the opinion that I have regarding his amenability for treatment. So,
Maybe the easiest way to ask the question is, of the testing that you did, which testing items were used for your risk assessment?
the personality assessment inventory informed the risk assessment. And within the risk assessment, I make reference to 3 different measures of risk.
Okay. So when we talk about the I'm gonna get that wrong.
You did, you showed that you could do it. You got dysthymia correct earlier, so. Psychopathy,
Psychopathy,
okay,
it just looks like psychopathy, psychopathy.
okay.
What is the psychopathy checklist revised second edition for, and what's it do?
Well, it is a measure of the construct of psychopathy. In other words, trying to identify individuals who are psychopaths. And the reason this is important to the court is because an individual who is low on this trait is a person who cares about the feelings of others, has the capacity for empathy, realizes that their actions may have important impacts on other people, tends to learn from their mistakes, tends to learn from punishment. And the bottom line is, whether I was in this court discussing sex offender recidivism, general violence recidivism, individuals who are high on psychopathy have higher rates of recidivism regardless of the subject matter that I might discuss in a sentencing. So it's at the heart of my evaluation. So the psychopathy checklist is an embodiment of 20 factors that have been related to this construct of psychopathy. And the job of the psychologist is to review each of the 20 factors and give the subject a score. And the score, it's a 3-point scale going from 0 to 2. 0 is the trait's not present, 2 is that there's unequivocal evidence that it is present, and the 1 is to represent that the person lies somewhere in between or you don't know. So I thought it was really important to rate him on this because I knew I'd be in a courtroom answering questions about treatment amenability and the likelihood that he'll respond to treatment and other corrective efforts.
Without going through what all the raw data was that you looked at, did you get a score?
Yes,
And what was the score? What was the raw score?
Okay, the total score was 21. And this is a little bit less than average when compared with other male prisoners. And when I say a little less than average, the lower the score, the better. So, so he compares to other prisoners. That's the bad news. The good news is that he's clearly below the threshold of where we call him a psychopath. And so he's way below that threshold score, but the score that he did obtain is convincing to me that he does carry some risk factors.
Okay,
And
let's talk about this briefly now. So your determination from, I'm just gonna call it the PCL, okay? That the short version what it's called?
no, psychopathy is the only term I'll respond to.
Okay,
Okay, no, PCL is fine.
so the psychopathy,
Yes,
his result, does it suggest that Joshua is not a psychopath?
that is correct.
And what does it define what a psychopath is?
Well, like I mentioned in page 15 to 16 of my report, these are people who are grandiose, egocentric, they exploit, they're cold-hearted, they're shallow, they lack the sort of emotions that permit them to understand how other people feel. And beyond the academic definition that is listed there is when people are psychopaths, for the most part, they view other people as objects, things that you use. And the analogy I make is that when I'm at home and my washing machine gives up the ghost and is dead and won't work anymore, I don't have any hesitation about throwing it in the trash and getting a new one, because the washing machine, after all, it is an object. It's just something that cleans my clothes. But the problem with psychopaths is they sort of view people the same way. When I'm done with them, they're okay to throw away. They're just objects on this planet for me to exploit or take advantage of. And the other big problem they have is that the reason they constantly come through the system is because they don't learn from their mistakes. And they don't learn from their mistakes whether or not we're looking at their criminal record or whether they're in a laboratory where they are learning some simple tasks and you tell them if you get this wrong, you're gonna get an electric shock. They're the ones who kept getting shocked because they can't mobilize the sort of anxiety or experience to realize that there are better ways to deal with life and people.
So one of the things that you found in looking at risk factors is Joshua is not a psychopath and does not meet the definition or anything in the DSM-5 as to what a psychopath would be.
The DSM-5 is stuck on their antisocial personality disorder, which you can tell by the tone of my voice, receives a lot of criticism from forensic psychologists because we think by and large it's sort of irrelevant to a lot of people because you have to have this conduct disorder before you're 15.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, psychopathy is a much more respected construct because it really tells us how a person behaves in the here and now as an adult and how they profit, you know, whether they're able to profit from remediation and their mistakes. And in my forensic practice, when someone gets elevated on this and they're really high, and if I'm working for the defense, because of course I work for both sides, but if I tell the defense, look, I can go to court, but your guy has a 32 on the psychopathy checklist, that's usually the time they tell me, thank you very much, I'm done.
So if I understand what you're saying about the PCL, is it looks at sort of a short term, what's kind of going on right now?
No, it's long-term. It picks up long-standing patterns of behavior. Now, people tend to have decreased psychopathy scores with time. There does tend to be some burnout, but for the most part, if they're really elevated on this, again, regardless of the subject matter why I may be in court, they're not good candidates for rehabilitative efforts.
If I understand what you're saying, Josh does not fall in that category. Josh
He does not fall in that category. He doesn't view people like they're washing machines or objects, and he learns from mistakes.
Now, you indicate in here that he's likely to have deficits with empathy and adhering to laws and mores, suggesting a moderate level of risk of general recidivism if he were released in the immediate future. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, even though the good news was that he scored way below the threshold for being considered a psychopath, that doesn't mean a score of 21 isn't necessarily a good score. And that's what his score was. That shows that he still has some significant deficits in that area that will translate to increased risk. And that's why, you know, given it a 21, and I know this isn't even a consideration, but theoretically, if he were to be released tomorrow, based on this score alone, I would say there's a pretty good chance he's going to be in trouble again within the next 6 months.
If I understand what you're saying, then, is that this shows that if he was released right now, he's not a good candidate for being released now, but with treatment, over the long haul and we'll talk more about borderline personality disorder decreasing with time, he's a good candidate for rehabilitation and re-release into the community at some point.
You know, he actually may be, because when I administered another instrument that looks at factors that are subject to remediation or treatment, he actually had a much better score on that.
Okay.
So, you know, again, there were 3 risk assessment instruments. They each take a picture of the person from a different angle. And the psychopathy checklist certainly should evoke some caution in decision makers if the decision was, could he be released, you know, this week. But on the other hand, I gave him another measure called the LSI, which stands for the Level of Service Inventory. And this looked at, asked the question, where does he lie on risk factors which are amenable to treatment or intervention?
Is the PCL, does it look at static risk factors?
For the most part, it does.
And tell us what static risk factors
A
are.
static risk factor is, well, the epitome of the static risk factors is on the VRAG, the Violence Risk Appraisal Guide, which I discuss on page 17, and I think it would be more informative if I use that as example of static risk factors.
No, that's fine. We can talk about that at the same time.
Okay,
What I'm just trying to figure out is the PCL as well as the VRAG, do they look at static things?
right.
And then, so I want to define what static means, that what we're looking at here at these things.
Okay, a static risk factor is usually a risk factor that once you have it, it's not gonna go away. You typically carry it for the rest of your life.
Okay,
And that's opposed to a dynamic risk factor.
that was what I was gonna ask you.
Okay, a dynamic risk factors are risk factors that are important, but they're changeable. And that means that if someone gets the right intervention, they carry less risk, but if they're in the wrong place, their risk can even get higher. They're changeable factors.
So the level of service inventory is the one that looks at dynamic risk
It
factors.
actually is one of all these risk assessment tools, it's the one that has the best balance between static factors and dynamic. It does have some static factors in there, such as the number of, like for example, he can't change the number of times he's been arrested. The only way that can change is getting worse. That's a static factor. Because he's been arrested, he can't change his gender. Or I don't know if I can easily say that anymore, but I think you're getting the idea that there are some factors such as age, probably age is a better example, aren't amenable to change until you get older. So when we look at this other risk measure, the VRAG, which is on page 17, all of these are static factors. I mean, yes, static factors. They're
When you
not
look at the
changeable.
VRAG, also, is this something that is, basically you're looking at things in the short term with that? Or does it project out over years?
Well, the authors certainly try to indicate, they're talking about a 10-year projection in their research, but regardless of the research instrument I use to predict your client's risk, the accuracy is usually the best in the short run. And the analogy that I use is, if I was the best weather forecaster in Anchorage, and there was no question about that, I can guarantee you that my weather forecast for what the weather is going to be like in the next month is going to be more accurate than what it's going to be in April 2017. So what I'm saying is, with risk prediction, the greatest amount of accuracy is in the immediate future. And as time goes by, there may be other factors that become more important or less important and would change your risk prediction,
Okay,
just like the weather.
okay. So when we look at the VRAG, Joshua, without going through all the raw data again, he had a score of plus 17. And the range you're looking for is what, a -3 to a +3?
That's the average range. Actually, you know, ideally you'd want to be a -20 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at his scores, the scores that are negative are actually favorable. They decrease risk. The scores that are positive increase risk.
Okay.
So, the fact that there was an absence of early or of elementary school maladjustment through the 8th grade, that was present, so we got a -3 on that. That's a favorable factor. On the other hand, his history of drug problems and his failure on past conditional release, he got +4. Those really elevated his risk.
Let me put it this way. If I understand, if I look at the PCL and I look at the VRAG and I look at the raw scores, And the two sentences that I'm gonna refer to here are what I just said a second ago. He's a moderate level of risk of general recidivism if he was released in the immediate future. And on the VREG, those with the development sample with a plus 17 had an above average rate of violent recidivism up to 10 years after they were given the opportunity to reoffend. Is it a fair statement to say that, listen, right now, over the next 10 years, during that time, there's a greater risk for Joshua to reoffend, but as time goes on further, it's a less likelihood of him reoffending? And I'm talking about with treatment, control of, not drinking, treatment for his borderline personality disorder, things like that.
Josh has the potential to get a much better risk assessment 10 years down the road, where you would have far more acceptable ratings of risk. But on the other hand, if he doesn't involve himself in opportunities to grow, and he doesn't make an effort to try to turn some of this around, it could get worse.
So the ball's kind of in his court.
The ball is in his court.
If he wants to do better, he's likely to do better. If he doesn't want to do better, he's not likely to do better. Is that kind of a fair statement?
That's a fair statement, but it's not as bad again if he was a 32 on the psychopathy checklist. I think we would just be talking about his degree of badness in the future rather than the possibility that he could have a good outcome and turn his life around in many important ways.
Let's look at the level of service inventory. The level of service inventory, I think you said, was the one that has the best looking at static and dynamic factors.
Yes, it's a combination of both. And as I say midway through, the categories of factors that it looks through are criminal history, that's generally static, that's not going to change. Education and employment, that can be dynamic. And financial stability, that's another dynamic factor. Family and marital relations. I think I've already testified today that if we get ourselves into good relationships, we can improve. It also talks about living accommodations where you choose to live, leisure and recreational activities, how you plan to spend your time. There's the alcohol and drug problems, a factor that comes through on every risk assessment instrument anyone ever develops. Emotional adjustment, and the presence and absence of antisocial attitudes and orientation toward rehabilitative efforts.
So it sounds like most of this test looks at dynamic factors.
It looks at factors that can change.
Okay, and without going through all the raw data, Joshua scored in the 26th percentile when compared with other inmates?
Yes, he had a more favorable, the test is saying this young man has more resources for positive change than the average person in the development sample.
Now, when we look at these risk factors, I think there's an argument that is going to be made by the state and is, I think, referenced in the pre-sentence report that Josh's prospects for rehabilitation are limited or poor or guarded at best because he's basically bombed out of everything. And is that your take on it?
No, and there's two reasons why I would disagree with that.
Well, first of all, let me ask you this. Has Joshua had the type of mental health counseling that you're suggesting he have? Has he ever had that before?
No. Outside of that initial visit at Providence, when his mother brought him there and he did not want to participate in it, I really wouldn't consider that a full treatment trial.
Okay, and then he's been to a couple alcohol things. I think it was Volunteers of America because of his DUI. What's your understanding of what Volunteers of America is really?
I understand a lot of these are basically sort of psychoeducational classes. You keep a journal, you talked to other people who have had issues like this. The whole problem with his personality makeup, he is a dual diagnosis person. You need to treat the borderline personality disorder if you want the substance abuse to improve. You need to treat the substance abuse if you want the borderline to get better. And just simply looking at one without the other is really destined to fail.
And so, really, no one's ever done this before, so we don't know if Josh has never bombed out of something because he's never had it.
No, I would agree with that summary.
And the type of outpatient treatment that has been provided, the educational type, do you think that is a sufficient type of treatment that Joshua should have been receiving?
No, he certainly needs to have his alcohol addressed, but it fell far short of being sufficient. You know, again, it's dual diagnosis. It's like trying to treat a circulatory problem without looking at the other lung.
You know, let me ask you this about borderline personality disorder. I'm looking at the DSM-5 on page 665 under development and course. And it indicates that although the tendency toward intense emotions, impulsivity, and intensity in relationships is often lifelong, individuals who engage in therapeutic intervention often show improvement beginning somewhere during the first year.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Somewhat. I think that the DSM is being very conservative in that, because the best studies that I have read would indicate that individuals who are involved in treatment actually, that you get better improvement with that. You get higher rates of remission. And with a personality disorder, there's sort of a bad news, good news sort of deal. The problem with personality disorders is that they're chronic and they tend to be a pattern. So they're nasty and they're persistent. And that's the bad news. But the good news is that once you get a remission, it's unlikely that they will relapse again and become a borderline after remitting from it.
The DSM-5 also goes on, during their 30s and 40s, the majority of individuals with this disorder attain greater stability in their relationships and vocational functioning. Is that what you've seen in your experience and in studies?
I actually, well, I have seen studies that say the majority, but some of the studies say a large majority. And this almost goes full circle to what I talked about at the beginning, is the trick of treating borderlines is you keep them alive long enough to treat them, and then they tend to do rather well.
Is it, as a borderline personality, a person with a borderline personality disorder, as they get into their 30s and 40s, and I think you referred to this, do the symptomologies tend to burn out to some extent?
Well, they're, going back to how we went through the 9 criteria, there are some of those symptoms that decrease more than others.
Like which ones?
Well, the ones that show the greatest decrease are those involved with impulsivity, substance abuse, the anger. Those tend to drop down at the most rapid rate, where things like emptiness and having moods, you know, being depressed, tend to persist the longest.
Why do those impulsiveness, anger, and the other one was that you said, substance abuse, why do those tend to, I guess, remit, I'll use the word, faster than the other symptoms?
Well, that may be somewhat due to the neurobiology of this disease. I mean, but we know when we look at other samples, when we follow people through their lives, as you get older, you tend to be less impulsive, less prone towards substance abuse, even if you don't have borderline personality disorder. So that may be part of it.
And then I know one of the big issues here is the issue over Joshua's anger. You know, how do we know that his anger will dissipate over the course of time, even though it sounds to me like what you're saying, historically the studies are showing that. Is that a fair statement?
The studies would say the odds are that there's going to be a significant decrease in his anger and his emotional reactivity. But on the other hand, I'm talking about the trajectory of groups of people. It is a little bit harder to say exactly that this particular individual is going to have this change or other change, and that's why the best practice is to reevaluate people at regular intervals to see how they're progressing.
Is part of the thing to do to, I guess, deal with the symptom of anger, I'm just gonna call it anger, does the person get in their treatment taught essentially coping skills, how to deal with it, how to recognize it, what to do about it?
They not only get taught coping skills and how to be more appropriate in anger, but there's also a lot of work done at looking at what triggers their anger and how they misinterpret and they're oversensitive to possible abandonment or rejection from other people. So when you do cognitive therapy with this group, you might say, hey, you saw a list of names on a phone and you get really angry about that. What does it mean for you to learn that your girlfriend may have had, of course in this case we know she was talking about dog's names, but what would it mean to you to find out that your girlfriend has had past boyfriends? Why is that a big deal to you? Things like that.
Okay.
And help them realize that, gee, I'm really oversensitive and gee, I react to everything about people's loyalty to me, and I probably need to tweak or adjust how I respond to that.
What type of treatment does one get for borderline personality disorder?
They usually use various forms of cognitive behavioral treatment where you help people reinterpret the inputs that excite their anger or their loneliness or their feelings of rejection. And then there's work done with coping skills. This goes back to, like I gave an example that one author taught her patients when they really wanted to self-harm or mutilate that it was far more effective just to put your hand in a bucket of ice water for 5 minutes, pain without the loss of gain, because you didn't hurt yourself.
Okay.
And things like that. So the treatment's so successful in this. There's a number of people that have written manuals in how to help clinicians out there treat people who have borderline personality disorder.
I mean, it seems to me like you hear, someone has a borderline personality disorder, they're not treatable. And it seems to me from what you're saying that they are very treatable and you can have very successful results.
Absolutely.
And that as they get older, they start to just get better.
Yes.
With or without treatment.
Yes, but clearly treatment helps. But and again, I keep hammering. The big trick is keeping them alive long enough to mature a bit and improve in this area.
Now, the DSM-5 also says follow-up studies of individuals identified through outpatient mental health clinics indicate that after about 10 years, as many as half of the individuals no longer have a pattern of behavior that meets full criteria for borderline personality disorder.
Yes, and they say as many as half. That's technically true, but we do have some studies that actually are talking closer to 70% that remit fairly quickly, like over a 6-year period.
And those are some longitudinal studies?
Those are longitudinal.
And were those studies that you provided those to me and I gave them to Mr. Mayovis?
Yes.
And those studies are indicating that the range is somewhere between 70 and 75% as opposed to...
Well, one of the studies, that was a longitudinal study from 2003, I believe that the remission rate over a 6-year period was like 74 or 76%. It was in the mid-70s.
So even though you've indicated that in the short term, Josh should not be released because he has a higher rate of recidivism, it sounds to me like what you're saying is, yes, that's correct, but let's just say without treatment, it's highly likely that he's going to get better over the course of a time as he gets into his 30s and 40s.
That's correct.
With treatment, the chances are even greater,
Yes.
and that the percentage rate is more somewhere between that you're seeing based on your experience and the studies that are coming out, somewhere between 70 and 75% of them remit.
That is correct.
There's always going to be some that we're just never going to know if that's ever going to happen or not.
Sure. That's true of any disease, whether we're talking about internal medicine or psychiatry.
So the treatment and the studies look promising for people with borderline personality disorder.
They're very promising.
And in you looking at the testing that you did for Joshua, what did your testing show about Joshua's amenability to treatment and his chances of success at treatment?
Well, I used a scale in the personality assessment inventory because it has a good treatment amenability scale. And again, I want to remind you that on this test, he was very candid. He wasn't, this certainly wasn't a situation where he was trying to put his best foot forward.
On any of the testing that you did with Joshua, were all the test results, did they meet the criteria for being valid?
Yes.
Keep going.
So, let me reference the page of my report here. So I talk about the personality assessment inventory, some of the results on page 14 to 15. On page 15, I noticed that he had a favorable scale on this treatment, a favorable score on this treatment amenability scale, and the computerized narrative printed out a statement about that score. And is it okay if I read that?
Sure.
It says his responses suggest an acknowledgement of important problems and the perception of a need for help in dealing with these problems. He reports a positive attitude toward the possibility of personal change, the value of therapy, and the importance of personal responsibility. However, the nature of some of these problems suggests that treatment will be fairly challenging, with a difficult treatment process and the probability of reversals.
Tell us what that means.
Well, what that means is that if I were his therapist, I am probably going to have someone who comes into my office or in the setting that I'm practicing, who has the resources to change, wants to change, but is going to have some setbacks. Now, a lot of those setbacks will occur within the context of the relationship I have with the client, because borderline people are really scared about intimacy, and you have to get pretty close to your therapist. So when I've worked with individuals like this and they start to get close to me, as it's progressing, they like to push back and create distance and be difficult to manage. And a good experienced therapist would say, look, do you really have an issue with me, or is this the borderline stuff talking? Let's try to work through the issue or resentment you have with me in an appropriate way. And when you're treating individuals like this outpatient-wise, for example, when you plan to go on vacation, you have to warn them far ahead of time, because they'll look at that 2-week absence as being an abandonment thing, and you help them work through that. And if you stay there and the therapist and the client are willing to deal with the setbacks, which always occur, then by the end of a year or two, you have somebody who's functioning at a much higher level.
Okay, so it's, if I understand what you're saying, that it's relatively normal if you're in a treatment setting that you might have some setbacks to go forward again.
Right, but you know, I'm envisioning that this treatment would be provided in a correctional facility.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the advantages that that clinician has is they don't have to worry about setbacks secondary to intoxicants or substances. That's being taken out of the picture. You know, I think we can be relatively assured of that because of the facility, the environment where it's being treated. So,
let's talk a little bit about the substance abuse issue with Josh. He needs additional treatment for substance abuse. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
He's got a significant substance abuse problem.
He has a really bad one.
And is it fair to say that it's never really been addressed by the programs he went to?
I think they've addressed them, but I don't think they've addressed the whole Josh.
Okay, so what you're saying is you have the dual diagnosis, so you can't just do one without the other, you gotta kind of do them in combination with each other.
That's correct.
And that's never been done before.
No, it has not.
And do the testing that you did and everything based on your experience, knowledge, and training lead you to believe that Josh has good prospects for treatment and for rehabilitation to come back out in society at some point in time?
Yes, but when I envision him if he gets the privilege of coming back out, you know, I envision that taking place in some steps, under close supervision, with a lot of substance monitoring, good tests.
Such as like the parole board or probation, something like that, that's got a good eye on him and is making him continue treatment for substance abuse and borderline personality disorder.
I think by the time that he would come out, the main issue would be the borderline. I think the odds are that's really going to dissipate. I would then be more concerned about returning to substances.
So you think as Josh enters his 30s and 40s, the borderline personality disorder is going to remit and it's not going to be so much of an issue?
It's going to be less of an issue in all probability, and there's a strong probability of that.
And that his substance abuse is the main factor?
It probably won't be as bad, and this is going back to the research I've already discussed, saying that tends to die down a bit with age. But I think, you know, 10 or 12 years down the road, or 15 years, probably substance abuse is still going to be something I would be concerned about if I was doing a risk assessment or supervising his probation.
Now, you indicated, I think that comes back to, you indicated that there were 2 reasons why you believe his prognosis is favorable for rehabilitation. And I think you were on page 21 at that time.
I'm on page 21, but I'm not sure.
Under emotional and personal problems?
Okay. And just let me say, you know, I'm categorizing these largely to correspond with the categories that are in the level of service inventory, okay?
Okay.
So one of his areas of risk was emotional and personal problems. And the first piece of evidence I cited was that there was never any evidence I received that he was threatening self-destruction with Brianna. So one of the factors is I think there's a possibility he was already starting to improve his borderline adjustment.
Okay.
The second, and then the second factor falls back on the research indicating that this disease becomes less morbid, with maturity. So those are the 2 factors I'm talking about.
And then you indicated that your testing showed that Josh has a willingness to participate in a program, and if he does that, he's got a good prognosis.
Yes, and I think that's one change that I've seen since he's been incarcerated, because if I look at some of the writings he did, I think that he wasn't engaged in treatment at all. I think he, didn't take it very seriously. So when I see that attitude displayed on a test where I know I have good validity scores, I suspect that that's another change that has transpired since he became incarcerated.
And if just to kind of come full circle, I guess, do you think that alcohol is the main crux of his problem, and without alcohol, probably we're likely not standing here?
I think not only is that highly likely that we wouldn't be having this conversation, but again, if you look at the various risk factors where he was elevated, there would be so few of those if not for his alcohol history.
So if he didn't have the alcohol history, he actually, instead of being moderate on the scale, he would have been a low risk.
He would have been much lower.
And on which scale are we talking about?
Well, we certainly on the VRAG,
Okay.
all his failures on conditional release related to alcohol arrests The VRAC has an item for history of alcohol problems. Number 9, where he scored 6 points, was the highest point he got, is the number of prior admissions into a correctional facility. And that would have greatly fallen because all but one of them was alcohol related. So yes, much better score if alcohol had been out of the equation.
It would have been a much lower risk.
Right.
Okay. So really what he needs to, besides his, the main thing, I guess, with his dual diagnosis, he needs to really have some significant alcohol treatment. Coupled
Yes.
with the treatment and for the borderline personality disorder. And if he gets those, then he's likely to be a good prognosis for rehabilitation and a low risk to for recidivism.
Well, that would be the best scenario, but again, I hope that in the future, he's seen by some psychologist who's able to reevaluate him and determine what the best course, that whatever we do today, we don't micromanage that person so much that they can't do what is in the best interest of this state and Mr. ALMEDA.
Okay. I just want to ask you one other area quickly, and then I'm going to turn you over to Mr. Mayovis. You also looked at another factor was Josh's motivation for the shooting here,
Yes,
for the killing of Miss Moore.
yes.
Now, besides them being in a domestic relationship, you have a significant history over your career of dealing with domestic violence.
Yes, and I've been to more scenes like this than I care to reflect upon.
Other than the fact that they're in a relationship, do you think that this was an act of domestic violence towards her?
Well, let me preface, no one will ever really know for sure, but I highly doubt that this was an act that he killed her because he was angry at her, or that he killed her because he wanted to.
Why?
Well, I sort of looked at I ruled out one hypothesis at a time. I started by looking at, could this be domestic violence? Well, when we look at domestic violence, injuries or homicides, we're looking at a phenomenon generally where you see a pattern of escalating violence. And the person ultimately...
Objection, Your Honor. I'm fine with Dr. Zelig offering his psychological opinion about Mr. ALMEDA, but this was my concern, is that we're going to go down a rabbit hole now where Dr. Zelig is going to be opining what a medical examiner or somebody that is a specialist in that field, which is not at all what I anticipated him. In fact, I was told that he would not be asked these kind of questions by Mr. Lambert, and I'm going to object to him talking about his assessment of what the evidence shows in this case.
I'm not asking him what the evidence shows in this case. I'm asking him, based on his experience and training and knowledge in the area of domestic violence, whether he thinks that this was an act of domestic violence. I'm not asking him to weigh on the evidence. This isn't a question. I'm not asking him.
I'll let him go. I think it was at least my conclusion from reading his report that he made an assessment whether there was a history of domestic violence in Mr. ALMEDA's relationship with Ms. Moore, and to the extent that he's going to talk about that, I'll let him do it.
Let me make this real clear, Judge. I told Mr. Mayovis that I would not be asking him whether he was guilty or not guilty of any type of criminal offense. Dr. Zelig is not going to testify that I believe he's an innocent man here who's been wrongfully convicted. Not going down there. That's what I told Mr. Mayovis I would not be asking.
This is not my, let me point out the irony of what's going on here. In his own sentencing memorandum, Mr. Lambert conceded the domestic violence aggravator because he has to in this situation. Now we're going to ask Dr. Zelig to opine that it wasn't a domestic violence event. This is schizophrenic.
Well, it's not. I conceded it because you have to, because they're in a relationship. So you have to concede domestic violence anytime anybody's in a relationship under that. You can't win that mitigator, aggravator.
Listen, I understand the distinction I understand the question to be, and if you're not asking it, then I'll ask it, whether or not Dr. Zelig thinks that this homicide reflected the same pattern of manipulation and violence that Mr. Almeida had in other relationships. If that is your question,
That is my question.
then you can ask it, because he made an assessment of the history with Mr. Almeida and Ms. Moore, and you can answer that question, Dr. Zelig.
Go ahead.
Like I say in the report, I found no evidence that there was any domestic violence in their relationship. And I found no evidence that he ever mistreated or threatened Bree. I certainly didn't see any evidence of, well, there was no violence to escalate. And that's typical of domestic violence injuries. So, can I be 100% accurate? Nobody can. I mean, 100% certain? Nobody can, but there's just no evidence to support that hypothesis.
Thank you, that's all the questions I have.
Before I turn things over to you, Mr. Mayovis, I've made this decision listening to the direct. First of all, Mr. Mayovis, do you have an extra copy of Dr. Zelig's forensic evaluation?
I do have an extra copy, Your Honor.
All right, I've made a decision that you can release that to Mr. Moore with this condition attached. Mr. Moore, your immediate family only, and of course with maybe released with your representatives from victims' rights. When I say your immediate family only, that's to be shared with them. Today is, of course, the first time I've heard anything about Facebook issues, but it's not to be published or anything. But it's dawned on me that I don't want to adversely impact your procedural right to make a statement to me at sentencing, and that statement obviously should be one directed at the issue of rehabilitation, which is a sentencing issue that I have to consider. Dr. Zelig's already talked about, clearly he's orally talked about 70% of what's in the written report, but it's my view you're entitled to read it in order to make an effective oral statement to me if you wish. So it may be released to you. I see Ms. Sears is right there with you. But that is not to include the background data, there's underlying testing data and stuff. That's not to be released. But the written report that he's been referring to and talking about today, you can have it so you can read it before. Obviously, we won't get you tomorrow.
Judge, could we take the sealed version that's exhibit and make that exhibit 3 but leave it sealed?
Yeah.
For the purposes of this, so
Yeah,
we
no,
have
that's
it,
fine. That's
so it
fine.
doesn't go to the general public.
That's fine. That's fine.
I don't know, maybe we should seal exhibit A or 1 and 2 also. They're basically parts of it.
If you wish.
I would ask it all be sealed for public.
Okay. That's fine.
I would ask
I'm not sure that is sealing the right word, Madam Clerk. What's
confidential, whatever it is, so the general public can't get to it.
Yeah.
Um,
Without the appropriate request to me or whoever, yeah.
What I want to make real clear in my understanding is that that's fine. I mean, I kind of suspected you would release it to the Moore. So when you say immediate family, you're talking Mr. Moore's wife and their daughter,
Or daughters.
or daughters, however many children they have. I
Yeah.
don't know how many they have.
Yeah,
And that those will not be disseminated to anybody else.
correct.
They will not.
Other than Ms. Sears and Ms. Winston.
That's fine, OVR. But they will. Nobody is going to put this on Facebook.
Right.
The Moores aren't going to stand up in
Right.
front of a television camera when this is all over and go, look at this. This is what this psych eval says, so on and so forth.
Correct. No,
It's-
it's to enable them to make an effective comment to me tomorrow. And if they see things in there that I think are inaccurate, when Dr. Zelig is reporting what Mr. Almeida told him, then they can bring that to my attention. That's
No,
what their,
that's fine, I just
that's
wanna
what their
make,
right includes.
I
And
just-
that's why I'm releasing it.
that's fine, I just wanna make crystal clear
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
I'm more concerned about Mr. Moore than I am anybody else in the family. And so I just wanna make sure that's crystal clear on the record here.
Okay. Next question is, we have to take a break sometime in the afternoon. Mr. Myovas, do you want to break now? If we do that, then you'll go straight to, we'll break till 3 and we'll go straight till 4:30? Or I can let you go a half hour and then we'll break?
Are you anticipating that I have at least an hour and a half with Dr. Zelig?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, Judge, I think that that's a fair thing that we should probably go ahead and break now.
Okay.
I want to set up PowerPoint too, so it can kind of stream through things a little bit quicker.
Yeah.
I don't know what the PowerPoint is, I haven't
It's
seen it.
things that we've already talked about, it's only excerpts from the reports
Well,
and a graph.
that's fine, I like,
Yeah, just,
I'd like to see it
yeah.
before, you
It's
know.
fine. I'll
Yep.
show.
On the break, show it to him.
Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will take 20 minutes again, just because of security issues, same restrictions apply. We have to clear the courtroom, you can leave things here, you just can't have access to them. So, sorry there's not room for you to gather outside the courtroom, but we'll see you in 20 minutes.